Al asked me to do a piece on Terrible Tom Silverstein. I spent a disproportionate amount of time in special housing units for disciplinary reasons during my years in federal prisons. I was often celled up with active members of the Aryan Brotherhood while I was in the hole, and I'd hear violent tales of convict folklore. One name that came up frequently was Terrible Tom Silverstein, one of the most feared and respected founding members of the Aryan Brotherhood, or as it's commonly referred to in the penitentiaries, the Brand. The Aryan Brotherhood had originated in California's San Quentin State Prison in the late 60s and early 1970s. It was in response to the race wars and subsequent formation of the Hispanic hierarchies of prison gangs in California. The Caucasian population was often victimized by these organizations, and the Brand surfaced to protect the white race. The Aryan Brotherhood would later become allies with the Mexican Mafia and become more involved with the illicit underground economy of the prison system. But in its infancy, the Brand's goal was to rule with intimidation and leave an impression with the use of unprecedented brutality. Their murders victims off tier posts to set examples. Even though their numbers were small, the fear tactics secured a place of reverence and required caution from their opposition. Federal prisons had helped proliferate and expand the influence of the Aryan Brotherhood, as some of the most volatile members started being shipped to federal pens all throughout the country, building a stronger network of members. John Gotti would eventually ask them for protection after his 1992 bust.
A man who is part of the reason the Supermax prison was built has died.
67-year-old Tommy Silverstein died this month. He was in intensive care following a surgery earlier this year. Continuing our coverage of Colorado at 6, Silverstein went to prison back in '78 for armed robbery. He was later found guilty of killing a prison guard and 2 inmates at a federal pen in Indiana. Well, those murders inspired the design of the Supermax prison here in Florence, Colorado. Silverstein was moved there in 2005. It's believed he spent more time in solitary confinement than any other federal inmate. He was in solitary at various prisons since 1983.
Throughout the years, the Brand started accumulating enemies from other parts of the nation, namely DC blacks who had seen a sharp influx in the late 70s, gaining power throughout the East Coast and Midwest. Terrible Tom Silverstein picked up his affiliation with the Brand during a short stint at San Quentin for armed robberies. He was paroled and was later convicted federally for his involvement in another string of armed robberies that he had pulled off with his father and first cousin in California during the late 1970s. Terrible Tom was sent to the infamous Leavenworth Penitentiary. The Aryan Brotherhood had a relatively low-key presence at the facility when Terrible Tom arrived. He began to rapidly ascend the organization's pecking order, building a reputation for being violent, fearless, and criminally sophisticated. In the first 2 years of Terrible Tom's sentence, he allegedly killed a younger member of the Aryan Brotherhood named Danny Atwell, who had refused to have his girlfriend smuggle drugs into the prison on behalf of the Brand. Terrible Tom was deemed a problematic inmate and was shipped to a high-security unit in Marion Penitentiary. Marion is a relatively soft prison today in 2019, because it's one of the only federal prisons with a sex offender rehabilitation program. But in the late 1970s, Marion was one of the most combative prisons in the federal system. Edward Bunker, who wrote highly celebrated crime books, including Education of a Felon and Animal Factory, who would later co-star in Quentin Tarantino's Reservoir Dogs, had talked about his experience at Marion in great detail. At one point, he noted that it was so volatile that there were 400 guards for every 100 inmates. It was a very dangerous place to do time. The DC Blacks and Aryan Brotherhood had started to beef in this era. In 1981, Terrible Tom strangled Robert Chappelle to death in a cell. Chappelle was one of the high-ranking members of the DC Blacks, and the organization immediately started planning a retaliation against Terrible Tom. Shortly after Chappelle's strangulation, DC Blacks boss Raymond Smith, who's also known as Cadillac Ray, was transferred to the Marion facility. Terrible Tom knew that Cadillac Ray was trying to murder him, and the two strategically circled each other for several months, until Terrible Tom and AB soldier named Clayton Fountain plunged makeshift knives into Smith nearly 70 times, killing him, and they then paraded his mangled corpse on the cell block, making a statement to the wide-eyed inmate population. Terrible Tom was sent to the hole. He was still able to call shots from the confines of his cell. He began butting heads with a CO named Merle Klutz. Their feud had culminated after Klutz had shaken Terrible Tom's cell down and taken his extra linen while he was at recreation. Silverstein took this as the final straw of disrespect, decided to conspire with former associate Clayton Fountain to murder 2 COs simultaneously in 2 separate parts of the prison.
You turn to these 2 guys. At this point, you're out of handcuffs, so they know something's coming. Do you have your knife in your hand?
Yeah.
And what's their reaction?
They just back up like this.
They hold their hands up?
Yeah. I
And
told
what
them,
do
get
you
out of
say?
here.
Say, get out of here?
Yeah. So they ran down the tier, and then I ran after Clutch.
And he, at this point, he's away,
Yeah.
and
Well, he's seen me coming. He
sees you coming.
He sees me coming.
and what's he do?
And he freezes.
Uh-huh.
He's just standing there looking at me. And I just go all the way off. I just, I just go all the way off. I just start stabbing him. We're fighting. He's hitting me and stuff, but I just keep stabbing him. And then he runs down the tier.
Is he saying stop, don't? Is he saying,
I'm not hearing nothing.
what do you mean when you're going off? You mean it's just,
It's just, all I see is his hands moving and me stabbing. It's just, everything just goes blank. And the next thing I know, he's running down the tier. And I'm running behind him. And he runs past the door and he's slamming the door. Well, one of the guards picked up a club and hit me in the head. And,
so he tried to, one of the guards did try to help him.
well, later he ran down into the lock box and got a club.
Uh-huh.
And then ran back. And he cocked me in the head when I was running after Clutch.
Uh-huh. Did you stab him?
No, I just backed up. I could have, but he was always all right with me. By then, after I was running after him and stuff, I was out of that. I wasn't, it was like a big weight lifted off me. I just, it was over. I didn't want to, I could have, I could have done it, but
You did?
no.
The brand was already smuggling balloons full of heroin into Marion through contact visits, and Terrible Tom requested that someone from the outside world put a handcuff key in the next balloon that was to be smuggled in. In the hole, if an inmate is moved for any reason, he must be handcuffed and escorted by several guards. They know that violence from inmates is likely because of the inhumane nature of solitary confinement, so they don't even give you an opportunity to have free hands around a CO. Before leaving the cell to go to recreation or the shower, you have to move backwards towards the cell door, and they open a meal slot that you put your hands through to be cuffed.
You say you dream about it? What do you mean?
Yeah. I've dreamt about him for years. I just see him in my dreams a lot of times. I see his wife a lot too. I feel real bad for her.
How do you know about his wife?
Well, I seen her in court. She came in court hearing.
What did she do? Did she look at you? Was she crying? What?
And her and her daughter, I think it was. I think he's got a daughter or something. She was crying and stuff. And I was thinking, man, she looked like a real nice lady. And I'm thinking, man, how could this creep be married to her? But I was thinking, he's got family too. Yeah, it was weird sitting there watching her go through that trip. But then, it's real guilty because everybody just hears how mean and rotten I am for doing that. And like he was just, they put him behind a badge again, like he was just doing his job, keeping these dangerous prisoners, in line. And it wasn't like that at all, man. That guy got off on making people's lives miserable. And you're sitting there and you're listening to everybody talk bad about you, and you're like you're scum on earth, that you don't have any compassion for anybody, you're just a mad dog, killer. And what was, I never tortured anybody.
And you feel like he was.
Oh, I'm sure he was.
And he was the person who was tortured, obviously, it's you. Every day. And none of that ever came out? Did anybody ever believe your side of it?
Nobody's, I told my story, and see, and this is another thing about the law, I brought witnesses for the last 3 years to testify all these events, because nothing really happened there that people never heard of, because we're all right there together.
Right. Witnesses other convicts?
Yeah, well, they said the only witnesses I could call was the people that was on the scene at the time.
Okay.
I said, well, if you just look at it at the scene at the time, I look like a maniac. It's like me and you arguing, and all of a sudden you call me a name and I just punch you out.
Yeah.
I just look like a hothead. But if I can't show what you did to me for 3 solid years, where it just built and built and built and built, you know.
And what happens, they come to you at that point and say, well, we're all BP now, that's why would you report this?
Yeah.
Where's your case?
Yeah.
Terrible Tom ordered a young AB member to go to the hole on purpose and bring the handcuff key. Several guards, including Merrill Klutz, began ushering Silverstein down the cell block to take him to the caged recreation hour. When he got to his brand associate's cell, he made a sudden jolt towards the cell bars and turned around. The associate quickly used the key to uncuff him, and he handed him a large shank. Tom swung the knife wildly at Merrill Klutz and proceeded to stab him several times in the neck before he was tackled and restrained by the other COs. Klutz died. Clayton Fountain carried out a similar homicide in a different area of the prison as planned. Terrible Tom was already serving a life sentence for the other homicides that he had committed at Marion. The judge issued a lifetime no human contact order, and he was shipped back to Leavenworth. There's a book called The Hot House that was written by a former Washington Post journalist named Peter Early. He was granted unadulterated access inside the notorious prison. The book describes several inmates that were serving time there in the 1980s. The book immortalizes the legend of Terrible Thomas Silverstein by explicitly describing his bizarre living conditions there. Because of the no contact order, the guards at Leavenworth had erected a large guerrilla-style playpen structure in the basement of the prison. There were 2 large spotlights on Terrible Tom at all times, and they made a conveyor belt that they sent him his meal trays on. When he was finished with the meal, he put the tray back on the conveyor belt and it went back to the guards. According to prison legend, convicts would hear his screams reverberating all night from somewhere deep in the bowels of Leavenworth. He lived this way for multiple decades in complete solitary confinement. It has been said that Terrible Tom and his institutional unmanageability were the impetus for the underground ADX super maximum federal prison in Florence, Colorado, the same place that houses the Unabomber, various terrorists, and soon convicted drug lord El Chapo Guzman. Terrible Tom was transferred to ADX in 2005. In his final days, Silverstein stayed busy despite the fact that he was locked up 23 hours a day with only 60 minutes for recreation each day. He blogged about prisoners' rights, painted, sketched, and was working on his memoir with Pete Early, the same journalist who had perpetuated Silverstein's folklore in the Hot House. Terrible Tom filed a federal civil lawsuit against the Bureau of Prisons in 2007, challenging the constitutionality of his inhumane conditions, but eventually he lost the case in court. He died from heart failure on May 24, 2019. He had spent 36 years in solitary confinement, and his death made national headlines.